If Homo economicus is real, you already know what this video is going to be about. In fact, you have already anticipated the consequences of this video in your decision making. Hence, watching this video is pointless. If, in contrast, Homo economicus is not real, then one of the foundational blocks of economics implodes and the structures that we have built on top of it become shaky. Teaching economics may then not be worthwhile as much, and watching this video may be pointless. Hence, either way, this video has no value at all. What we know is that this video is pointless, and as many videos to my experience that are published on this platform do not add an awful lot of value and still are very popular, this must become a very popular video. The number of views a video gets seems to be inversely related to the information value of the video itself. There are, according to Kate Raworth, whom I have here, Kate Raworth in her book Donut Economics gives ascribes five characteristics to Homo economicus, and then she continues to debunk those assumptions on the behavior of mankind. First, she says man is, according to economics, self-interested, and already from Adam Smith in 1776, I believe, at least second half of the 18th century, we know that self-interest of people is a feature that makes markets tick. It's the heart of capitalism. People trade because they want to improve their situation. We don't go to the bakery to improve the living conditions of the baker, but rather because exchanging our money for bread adds utility, makes us happier. So self-interest is the first characteristic. Ego at heart, Raworth says. The second assumption is that of exogenous preferences. What we want, so what we want to buy, what makes us happy, is both not determined by the competitive market forces and also fairly stable. To foreshadow a bit Raworth's critique, marketing efforts may make us aware of products we didn't know we wanted to have in the first place. So the strategies of firms may indeed affect what we want to buy. But Homo economicus is assumed to be characterized by stable exogenous preferences. The third characteristic is that that humankind is isolated. They're independent from others in their environment. It is their utility that they care about. They're not dependent on other people's utilities. Your decisions are not affected by the decisions of others, and hence you can look at the choices of an individual without taking the choices of other individuals into account. Fourth, a key characteristic is that people are calculating. Raworth says they're not only ego at heart and money in hand, but also a calculator in mind. Constantly we weigh the cost and the benefits of the options that we have available, and we always pick the one that makes us best off. Veblen in 1898 wrote that men are characterized as in economics, lightning calculators of pleasures and pain, and that's about what this assumption of maximizing, calculating humans is about. Fifth, the idea that, which is not too important for the modeling itself, but the idea that humans dominate over nature. Rather than us being embedded in a system of ecology, of nature from which we which we use, but to which we also give back, men are assumed to dominate over nature. Now, interestingly, if you look at the development of Homo economicus over time, it was originally not proposed as a realistic depiction of what human behavior would be like. While Adam Smith acknowledged that people may be expected to be self-interested and that this self-interest drives market performance, he acknowledges that there's also other things that people care about, for example, other people in their environment, and that it may actually also may make you happier if other people around you are happy, and that you may thus do something that go at the expense of your own utility, of your own happiness, if it would make others better off. Self-interest is a key ingredient of market performance, but it is not a trait that is the sole interest that humankind takes into account when making economic decisions. Mill, a couple of decades later, acknowledged that this depiction of mankind as the Homo economicus, I don't think the term was coined as such at that point, but that was a depiction that, quote, no economist would ever be so absurd so as to suppose that mankind are really thus constituted. So no economist would believe that this depiction of mankind is in any way realistic. Now, unfortunately, the depiction of the image of the ego at heart, calculator in mind, money in hand, isolated individual with fixed preferences came in quite handy. So what was originally believed not to be a realistic depiction of mankind became a very helpful building block for economic theories. And we can then see, for example, here is that many microeconomic models were built with the idea in mind that you could that from these assumptions you could then build models that actually predict the behavior of individuals in markets. So you could mathematically model the behavior of an individual because they're all assumed to behave alike. So if an individual prefers a particular outcome over another outcome, then you can predict what they will do if the relative prices of these two outcomes of these two products changes. Just like the atom in physics, the Homo economicus was the smallest unit of analysis from which you can generalize, from which you can formulate models. And these assumptions make it very convenient to study the performance of markets. Now, what you can then continue to do, and that's another branch of economics, is to add all these markets up to form one country, and then later even to form multiple countries. And there, again, if you can aggregate demand in a specific market, then you can also continue to add up all these demand curves to a concept known as aggregate demand. So what you can study is how many goods are sold in a particular country and produced in a particular country, depending on the circumstances. So from the level where we say that if a person has a particular income, a budget curve, we can predict what that person will then buy if we know his preferences. And if we assume that he wants to get the most out of the money that he has available, we can also pile up all these individuals and say, well, if their joint income changes, for example, if unemployment changes, then what does that do to the buying behavior of consumers in that market? And then from that, you can build models that explain, for example, what happens if you introduce forms of fiscal policy. So what happens if unemployment benefits rise, or if you install import tariffs on goods that you buy from other countries. And these models became really helpful in predicting the effectiveness of government policies, whether it's fiscal or monetary policies. So that's another set of theories that build on the foundational assumption around how these atoms of economics, how mankind behaves in markets and hence in countries. All right. So that's one. This depiction of mankind was not intended to be a realistic depiction of man, but it became a realistic depiction of man, or at least it became a depiction that theory used a lot because it came in handy to build mathematical models. Another thing that we saw happening is that these theories become self-fulfilling. And a classic example is a formula that was used to determine the value of derivatives, so of stock options that were traded in a market, the Black-Scholes formula. And originally that formula didn't perform too well, but over the years the model did increasingly better at predicting the values of whatever was traded in that market. And then economics started to see here, this theory originally it didn't do so well, but now we see that it is a very good theory indeed. And the ones who, the scientists who made up the formula actually won a Nobel Prize for their work. But when we started to look more thoroughly into this, the reason why the theory became reality is that traders started to believe that it was true. And hence, whenever they needed to determine the value of a particular asset, they first applied the Black-Scholes formula and then came to a valuation, and then that was their valuation. So rather than the theory becoming better at explaining the valuation of investors starting to adjust their valuation of assets to what the model predicted. Also in agency theory, where a key assumption is that you cannot trust the people that you transact with. The reason why bonuses are so effective may not be because there was a problem in the first place. It may well have been the case that originally you could trust the people with whom you traded. But then later on, as the agency theory became popular, as it became taught in managerial business programs, the students in these programs felt that, oh, I should now, I should distrust my employees, because that's what economics prescribes. And then those employees felt that they were being distrusted, and then thought, oh, well, if I'm distrusted, I might as well behave as they think I would. So an originally trusting employer and an originally trustworthy employee may turn into the model of economic mankind that is included in agency theory, exactly because they start to behave as the theory tells them they should behave, rather than the theory describing their actual behavior. So on the one hand, we see that this depiction of mankind and economics was a very valuable addition to the toolbox of the economists who wanted to mathematically build models that explain what we see happening in markets and countries, and that's why we then have these thick books that describe the performance of markets and countries with models assuming Homo Economicus. But on the other hand, also these theories became reality because of self-fulfilling prophecies. People started to behave as if the theories were true, and then the theories became true because the observed behavior was exactly as was predicted by the theory. Now, the comment as such that this idea of Homo economicus is not realistic is not new at all. I already talked about Veblen, the lightning calculator of pleasures and pains. That was 1898. So for more than a century, even before the idea really took root, one may say the critique that this is not a realistic depiction of human behavior was also there. And somehow this critique never really developed into an alternative model. And that is the challenge that mankind has ahead of it, at least that economists have ahead of it, and that Rayworth in her book mentions as well. The task of coming up with an alternative theory of mankind that is as all-encompassing as the Homo Economicus theory. Because the beauty of the Homo Economicus concept is, of course, that that it explains everything. It's a set of assumptions. It's a holistic view of mankind, and what economists so far have to, as a form of critique, is attacking bits and pieces, which are all true. People do care about others. People's preferences change over time. People don't always look for the best option that they have available. Sometimes they're just satisfied with what they have, and people are embedded in wider networks. They're not isolated. They're dependent on the environment. So for each of these assumptions, there's critique, which makes sense, but there is no holistic alternative to the Homo Economicus yet. The main task, I think, of economics for the decades to come up with a view of mankind that is able to compete as a whole with the Homo Economicus. And the challenge in developing such a model is not only that it is supposed to be holistic, but also that presumably this task is impossible to complete. It is quite likely that we will never come up with a model that has such a strong predictive value, such a strong and complete view of how people behave. So it's quite likely that we will not have a model of mankind that is as precise in predicting what people will do given the circumstances they find themselves in. Perhaps because such a model is impossible, because you cannot describe the complexity of human behavior with simple axiomatic assumptions. Improving the idea that we have of human behavior in economics may imply that we are no longer able to exactly pinpoint the micro foundations of all the patterns that we see happening in markets. The overall question that economics perhaps has to answer is whether we prefer to work with a hampered model of mankind that is able to derive generalizable predictions that make sense by and large, or whether we want to replace this model of mankind by a model that has much more modest reach, that cannot explain as much behavior as the Homo economicus pretends to have. So it's a more realistic model of behavior.